Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Richard Wrangham. He is currently Ruth B. Professor of Biological Anthropology in the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University, and he also founded the Kibale Chimpanzee Project in 1987. He has conducted extensive research on primate ecology, nutrition, and social behavior. He is best known for his work on the evolution of human warfare, described in the book Demonic Males, and also on the role of cooking in human evolution, described in his book Catching Fire: How Cooking Made Us Human. And the central topic of our discussion today will be his most recent book, titled The Goodness Paradox: The Strange Relationship Between Virtue and Violence in Human Evolution. So, Dr. Wrangham, it's really a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you a lot for taking the time.
Thank you, Ricardo. It's a delight to be here.
Okay, great. So let me first ask you, just to get straight into the central topic of your book, or the central thesis of it, what is really the goodness paradox in humans?
The paradox concerns aggression. In some ways, humans are extremely unaggressive compared to other animals. In other ways, we are very aggressive. We kill each other at high rates. So if you think of aggression as being on a single scale from unaggressive to very aggressive, then it's paradoxical, because we are at both ends of the scale. So the question is, how do we resolve this paradox that we are on the one hand very unaggressive, and on the other hand we are very aggressive?
Okay, so we have to talk about two different types of aggression here, right? On the one hand, reactive aggression, and on the other hand, proactive aggression, correct? So could you please tell us about the difference there?
Yeah, these two kinds of aggression resolve the goodness paradox, because instead of being on one scale of aggression, there are two scales. And the first scale I'll talk about is reactive aggression, and this is the one that is in many ways most familiar to us. It's the one that we all experience when we get angry, we lose our temper, something threatens us, it threatens our view of ourselves, maybe someone tries to take something from you, maybe someone interferes with your romantic relationship, and we flare up. This is reactive aggression. It's always emotional, and it's designed by natural selection to get rid of a threat. And the other one is proactive aggression. And proactive aggression is planned, premeditated aggression that is not necessarily associated with any kind of arousal. It's conducted very carefully in a way that is very unlikely to lead to the aggressor being hurt. And it can take a long time to plan. It's not an immediate reaction to a threat. And the thing about these two is that we now know that they are controlled in the brain by different mechanisms. So you have one scale, which is reactive aggression, and humans are very much at the low end of that. Compared to chimpanzees, for example, we have a very much lower frequency of reactive aggression. But then the other scale is proactive aggression, and we're very high on that. Compared to chimpanzees, for instance, we kill our other members of our own species at similar high rates to chimpanzees.
And proactive aggression is associated with things like war, right?
Yes, the context in which we see proactive aggression most frequently is war. So war is really almost always an exchange of acts of proactive aggression, where our side decides to make a raid or some kind of preemptive attack on the other side. And then, we conduct that, and maybe we kill some members of the neighboring group, and then the other group makes a raid on us, and we continue doing that until one side decides that it can't go on any longer.
Mhm. And is there any relationship between any of these two types of aggression and what biologists call redirected aggression? That is, for example, when the alpha male hits on a male that is above him or hit in the social hierarchy, and then perhaps that male then redirects that aggression to someone that is even below him or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I would think that it is most often associated with reactive aggression. That if you are attacked and you are immediately frustrated by the fact that you can't attack back because the alpha male is bigger and stronger and tougher than you are, then what do? You immediately go and attack somebody else. And this is one of the features of reactive aggression, that it is not particularly oriented towards a particular goal. It is lashing out at whatever is around you. And it's, in that sense, rather strange, because it can be poorly designed in the sense that it doesn't have a very specific goal, which distinguishes it from proactive aggression.
Mm-hmm. And what are the best ways that we have to approach the study of these types of phenomena like reactive and proactive aggression? Because when it comes to, for example, comparative biology or psychology, I mean, how do we decide in what terms we compare ourselves to other primate species like chimpanzees and bonobos? Because they seem to have some differences, right?
Well, if you're asking how do we take these two concepts of reactive and proactive aggression and work out the comparative biology of these in humans compared to chimpanzees and bonobos, right. The answer is that we're looking at the context in which these kinds of aggression occur. But the study of this has really not been elaborated in any kind of detail yet. So, I can, in my book, I draw attention to the fact that it looks as though chimpanzees are conducting acts of reactive aggression at something like 1,000 times the frequency of humans. And that's based on the fact that small fights break out among chimpanzee society very much more often than in humans. But really, exactly how many of those are proactive and how many are reactive, we haven't got a good way to operationalize those yet. It just seems as though the great majority are unplanned, the great majority of those acts of aggression. So, I look forward to people taking this distinction, which has been a very important part of psychology and biology for a number of years, and really starting to apply it to evolutionary anthropology, but also to behavioral ecology, because, what we need is for people to get sharp behavioral descriptions that distinguish between the two types, so that we can say of any act whether we regard it as proactive or reactive, and then we can get really confident descriptions of sex differences, age differences, species differences, contextual differences in the way that these two rather distinct types of behavior have evolved.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's about comparative biology, but even within our own species we can study traditional societies like the ones of hunter-gatherers and horticulturalists. So what are the sorts of information that we can obtain from those societies when it comes to understanding how these two types of aggression might have evolved in us, and then also a process that I also want to talk with you about today, that is the one of self-domestication?
I mean, the big observation, I think, that is very critical is that if you look at any society in the world, humans have got a very low rate of aggression in face-to-face interactions during the ordinary day. So one example here is that Kim Hill and Magdi Hurtado, who studied the Aceh hunter-gatherers of Paraguay. They say that in 44 years of observation, they have never seen males scuffle with each other. Well, that's ridiculous compared to chimpanzees, where if you went for 4 days without seeing a fight, you would be quite surprised, let alone 44 years. So there is just an order of magnitude, or 3 orders of magnitude difference between humans and chimpanzees in that respect. And in my book, I go through carefully in all the different sources of information on aggression rates in humans. Certainly males are horrid to females. They're aggressive to females in domestic violence in ways that we find extremely distasteful. But nevertheless, the rates at which these happen are much lower than in say, chimpanzees. And in general, it's quite clear that there's something special about humans. We are like a domesticated animal in the sense that we have a very low rate of reactive aggression.
Mm-hmm. And is it also important for us to study the evolution of our in-group, out-group dynamics when it comes particularly to proactive aggression in the case of war, for example?
Well, I think it's hugely important to understand more about proactive aggression because, as you rightly say, it is the principal feature we see in war. In the early 1970s, when it was discovered that chimpanzees sometimes make deliberate attempts to penetrate into the territories of their neighbors and look for victims to attack and kill, it was clear that there was something sort of hauntingly similar between this behavior and the behavior of people living in small-scale societies, be they hunters and gatherers, horticulturalists, or contemporary gangs in societies all over the world. And I think that many of us were very cautious about drawing parallels between that and the human condition, even though the striking thing was that chimpanzees and humans were the only species known to do this. So, us and one of our 2 closest relatives. So what did that mean? Well, I think now we can start understanding what it really does mean. And that is that proactive aggression has been evolutionarily favored because those males who are able to kill members of neighboring groups have beneficial consequences, because over the subsequent decades since the discovery of this behavior, we know that the unprovoked attacks, these premeditated attacks of proactive aggression, which lead to deaths of the victims, have led to advantages to the killers. And those advantages are that eventually they start eroding into the territory of the neighbors and taking it over. The result is they get more access to food. The result is that the chimpanzees have higher body weights. They're able to be in bigger groups. And the important thing is that they have more babies and have higher survival rates of their babies. So this is natural selection in action. And then the question becomes, why don't more species do this? And there are fascinating ecological strains there. But the important thing is that there seems to be something fundamental about the practice of this coalitionary proactive aggression involving coalitions of males, which leads to it being favored through natural selection.
Mm-hmm. And another thing that is favored through natural selection is also the fact that both in chimpanzee and human societies, when one group of men, let's say, or chimpanzees, wage war against another group, they also obtain access to more females and, in that case, sexual resources, correct?
Yeah, it's possible. We actually know less about that in chimpanzees. There are hints that sometimes females may be gained by extending the territory, but not necessarily, because what can happen is that the females in the neighboring territory, instead of leaving theirs and joining the new group, they just live in a smaller and smaller area. So female decisions about whether or not they accommodate to the new reality and live with the group that has taken over part of their territory, or whether they stay with the old group. We don't have enough enough data to make generalizations about that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's now talk a little bit about self-domestication, which is one of the main processes that you talk about in your book. So do you think that perhaps it would be easier for people to understand if we first talk about processes of domestication that we as humans have done with other animals and what result from them in terms of the features, the strictly physical and also the psychological features that change between wild and domesticated animals?
Yeah, that seems a good way to talk about this, because what is so striking about humans is that in some ways our behavior is like that of a domesticated animal, in the sense that we have these very low rates of reactive aggression, just like dogs do, say. But in addition, our anatomy is like that of a domesticated animal, because if you look at our skulls and skeletons compared to those of our ancestors in the middle of the Pleistocene, a few 100,000 years ago, what you find is a series of changes that are just like what you see in domesticated animals compared to their wild ancestors. So these include a smaller, lighter built body, a skull in which the face is shorter, the teeth are smaller, the males look more like females, and the brain becomes a little bit smaller than in the ancestor, which, of course, it is an unfamiliar concept in humans, but in fact, our brains have become smaller in the last 30,000 years. Well, so why is it that we see not only our behavior, but our anatomy looking like that of a domesticated animal? And what we find in domesticated animals is that in all of them, there is a suite of characteristics that are surprising, because they don't seem to be necessary for what actually happens in domestication importantly, which is they become less aggressive in order to be able to live with humans in the farmyard or in the house. And associated with the reduction in aggression, you get changes such as the familiar white patches that you see on different dogs and horses and cows and so on, floppy ears, a very common feature in domesticated animals, shorter tails, and then all of those features of the skull and skeleton that I just mentioned. Now, what we don't really have a good handle on is why you get all of these funny traits associated with domestication in addition to the aggression. But Adam Wilkins and Tecumseh Fitch and I have written an analysis of this, which suggests that there is some particular changes in very early development of the embryo that are required to be able to make you less aggressive, and that these changes also incidentally cause all of these different changes associated with domestication: the white patches, the floppy ears, the curly tails, the changes in the skull and the skeleton. And those biological changes are, we suggest, to a particular type of cell called the neural crest cells that appear and then disappear very early in the development of the embryo. Now, we don't know exactly about that, but it's a really intriguing hypothesis, I think, which has been already supported a little bit in 5 or 6 different species of mammals.
Mm-hmm. That's very... yes, please continue, yeah.
Well, so I was going to say, so that's domestication. Now, we ordinarily think of domestication as being something that starts with humans taking some animals from the wild, bringing them into captivity, and breeding the tamest ones. But in the critical experiment that really helps us to understand the process of domestication, the Russian biologist Dmitry Belyaev in 1958 started to breed from silver foxes by very deliberately only choosing for breeding those individuals that were least aggressive and least fearful. And what he showed was that as a result of this, you got the domestication syndrome. You got all of these mysterious features of domestication together with the reduction in aggression and fear and stress. And the critical thing about that experiment is that what this showed is that merely by selecting for tameness, then you get everything else. Well, the question that my colleagues and I have asked is, why should this be any different a process when it is handled by humans versus if it's handled by natural selection independent of human agency? Why couldn't it happen just because natural selection favors increased tameness in the sense of reduced aggressiveness in the wild? Because obviously there have been many species throughout evolutionary history that have had reduced aggression over evolutionary time. And so then we started looking at other species in the wild, and the classic example, I think, is the bonobo compared to the chimpanzee, because here we have our two closest relatives, look very similar to each other, great differences in behavior because the bonobo is much more peaceful, much less aggressive than the chimpanzee. And we started to look and see, could we see the domestication syndrome in this species? And you know what? Every single one of the features that characterize the skull and the skeleton of domesticated animals compared to wild animals are found in bonobos. They have that lighter built body. They have the shorter face and smaller teeth. They have the reduced degree of differences between males and females, with males looking more like females, and they have the smaller brain than the chimpanzee. So we feel that was a wonderful example of natural selection leading to reduced aggressiveness in a species, the bonobo, and as a consequence having the domestication syndrome. And this gives great confidence in the notion that you don't need to be in captivity to have the domestication syndrome produced. So then we can take it to humans. Now we go back to this question. Here we have humans, very unaggressive compared to most species in terms of reactive aggression, and has in our bones these similarities to domesticated animals. So are we a self-domesticated species? Could we have evolved to have lower levels of reactive aggression? And would this explain why it is that our skull and skeleton look like those of a domesticated animal?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just before we get into what might have happened during our evolutionary history that led to our self-domestication, let me just ask you this. Are there any important differences at the level of the brain and brain structures that are studied between animals that are more aggressive and others that are less aggressive in terms perhaps of the development of their prefrontal cortices or even their limbic systems and other areas as well?
It's an area that is still being investigated. The German biologist Dieter Kruska, he has done the most careful work looking at the limbic system differences between domesticated and wild animals. And he has found that in general, the limbic system, which can be thought of as a sort of source of emotional stimulus, and what he finds is that the limbic system tends to be reduced in domesticated animals more than the reduction of the brain as a whole. And on particular parts, the amygdala seems to be particularly reduced. But the studies have been only involving 6 or 7 species of domesticated animals compared to their wild ancestors, and the results are not totally consistent. So, you know, it's still early days, but it's clearly what we would expect. Because the amygdala is very much involved in the processing of fear, which leads to aggressive behavior. And we know that under some circumstances, if you have a smaller amygdala, then you tend to be less fearful.
The amygdala is the part of the brain that responds to threatening situations and things like that, correct?
Yes, right. It integrates information from elsewhere and, as it were, helps the brain to come to a decision about what to do.
And do you think that the fact that we as humans seem to be the species that has the most developed prefrontal cortices, that might also have played a role in the way that our aggressiveness evolved?
The prefrontal cortex is certainly very involved in inhibiting responses that come from the limbic system. We see this because when we have alcohol, then the prefrontal cortex is less effective in inhibiting, and that's when we're likely to be more reactive. The great difficulty with thinking about exactly what's happened in humans is that we have no comparisons that are really relevant, because the internal structure of the brain of Neanderthals, or even more appropriately, our direct ancestors in the mid-Pleistocene, those are unknown. We don't know what their brains were like. All we know is the volume of the brain, to judge from the volume of the skull. So, and we don't really want to compare humans with chimpanzees, because we left them 6, 7, 8 million years ago compared to 300,000. So we can look at domesticated species compared to their wild ancestors. We can get generalizations there. We can infer what likely has happened in humans, but we may have to resort to other kind of mechanisms to think deeply about the processes involved in human domestication. And the big opportunity is going to be with genes, because at least we do have genes of Neanderthals and Denisovans, both of which species, I mean, in the case of Neanderthals, they don't look like a domesticated species at all, so probably they were more reactively aggressive than us. My guess is that's true of Denisovans, though we don't know what they looked like yet. But we do know that in both those cases, they don't seem to have had changes to the neural crest cell genes in a way that have happened in sapiens. So that may be the start of a way to get at the differences between us and those Pleistocene species compared to domesticated animals and their wild ancestors.
Mm-hmm. And is there any important information that we can also obtain from studies that compare the brains and how the brain areas activate in response to different sorts of problems and situations between violent criminals and the general population, let's say?
Well, certainly, that's right. Adrian Raine is the leader in this area, and he has compared brain activity in people who have been accused of different kinds of murder. So you can look at murders and you can say this one was premeditated and planned, this was proactive aggression, and this one was just somebody losing his temper when someone insulted his mother in a bar, and that was reactive aggression. And are there differences in brain activity? Absolutely. And they fall exactly as you would expect. That is to say, the reactive murderers, or the murderers accused, the accused murderers in the context of reactive violence, are the ones whose activity, brain activity as measured by PET, is reduced in the prefrontal cortex. So they just have a reduced ability to inhibit stimuli coming from the limbic system. Mm-hmm. So these sorts of differences are probably quite important, because the way in which proactive and reactive aggression respond to drugs, or the tendencies for these aggression, is different. So the more we know about the biology of aggression in our own species, then the more we may be able to help individuals who have impulses that are antisocial, and they may themselves want to control.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and are there any aspects of social structure in our species or others even that facilitate self-domestication? For example, is it the case that things like female philopatry might facilitate this process?
I don't know of any evidence that that philopatry, which is the tendency for individuals to remain in the groups in which they're born all their lives, I don't know of any evidence that that is related to overall the degree of aggressiveness or the ease with which changes in aggression can be selected. And if you think about the domesticated animals that we know, the cats and the dogs, the horses and cows, camels and llamas, there's a very wide diversity of patterns of social structure. So it would be fascinating if someone finds some clues, but I'm not aware of any kind of association of that type.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and is there any way for us to try to connect this book of yours, The Goodness Paradox, with other research that you have done, for example, about human diet and fire and cooking? Could that have had any sort of influence on how we structured our societies and perhaps then how it led to self-domestication or something like that?
There could be some contact. The difficulty in thinking about this is that I believe we're talking about two different eras. So the era that is associated with self-domestication is the one which gave rise to us as a species compared to other species of Homo. That is to say, sapiens, which people now attribute the earliest emergence of sapiens to about 300,000 years ago. I think that cooking came in something more like 2 million years ago, so very much earlier. But the question you ask about similarity or connection between these two areas seems to me to make sense if we think about what was some of the social consequences of, for the first time, sleeping on the ground rather than in trees. So we know that the great apes, when they sleep in trees, each one builds their own sleeping platform, a nest, and they're all on their own all night, quite widely separated by several meters and more, even when they're in the same small subgroup. On the other hand, when people are sleeping around a campfire, then they're all very cozy and they come together. And it seems very likely that with the evolution of the control of fire as a cultural and ultimately kind of a biological trait, that people had to adjust these transitional ape-human individuals, had to adjust their social emotions to be calmer and gentler. It seems very reasonable that the fire would draw people together, and they would get advantages from being able to be close to each other all night in a way that none of the previous generations of apes had done. So, in other words, there should have been selection for calmer, tolerant, less aggressive individuals. My problem is that we don't have many ways to get at were there changes in the domestication syndrome at that time compared to their ancestors. It looks as though there might have been, there was a shortening of the face. In some ways, maybe you can talk about a lightening of the body, but we know too little to be able to get at that with any confidence. So it's fun to speculate about it, but we have much more on the biology in the later phase.
Okay. And in your book, you criticize approaches that other people have in trying to explain perhaps how humans evolved these very low reactive aggression and high proactive aggression. Particularly in the case of reactive aggression, there are people that talk about perhaps sexual selection mechanisms and even also women banding together to protect one another from aggressive males. So could you tell us about that and why you think that that is not enough to explain this particular aspect of our evolution?
Well, so the question is, if you have nowadays a male who is very aggressive, who is so aggressive that he is willing to use his physical dominance to get whatever he wants, then what does a society do about that person? And the reason that seems to be the question is that this should be a clue about how our societies in the past have controlled such people. Well, obviously nowadays what happens is that the police arrive and the person goes to prison. But the question is, what do you do in a society in which you don't have police and you don't have prisons? You can't call on anybody else. You're just living in a small camp of 30 or 40 people, and some guy is a complete jerk, and he decides that even if people shout at him and ridicule him and ostracize him and so on, he'll just carry on doing it his way, which means that if somebody comes home with a good piece of meat, he'll just go off and take some. And if there's some woman who's attractive to him, then he will just fight the husband and try and have sex with the wife and succeed. So he's raping and fighting and so on. And what do you do? Well, you know, one kind of nice idea, nice in the sense that it engages women in a very positive way, is that the women would all shout at him and challenge him and force him to change his ways. But the fact is that you can go to descriptions of behavior in hunter-gatherer and other small-scale society, and you do not find that that happens. Instead, it's very clear what does happen. And that is that when a man is sufficiently vile in his behavior, then the rest of the community decides that he needs to be killed. And that community might all just be men talking. Sometimes the women might be participating as well. And then the killing is done by men. And it's because of that consistent pattern in the small-scale societies that I think that we have to imagine that that is the same thing that happened in the distant past.
Mm-hmm. And in this case, since it were less physically formidable men who supposedly killed the most aggressive ones and disposed of them, and the most uncooperative as well, what was the role that things like language and cooperation played in the process?
The proactive aggression that humans use to kill other members of their species, particularly dramatically in capital punishment, is very similar to what you see when chimpanzees go out and kill members of neighboring groups. Mm-hmm. And so you have to ask yourself, well, what's different about humans? Because why is it that chimpanzees could not themselves have committed capital punishment? And in fact, chimpanzees even do sometimes kill members of their own groups in a way that is sort of a little bit human-like. But there is a clear difference between humans and chimps, and that is that chimps cannot get together and say to each other, you know, that guy over there is a real jerk and we need to decide to kill him. They cannot develop coalitions or alliances specifically to attack a member of their own group because they don't have the ability to communicate their ideas to each other. So they can have a fight which leads to coalitions and everybody piles on and attacks someone, but it's not planned. What humans can do is plan. And the way that they plan, of course, uses language. And it's a delicate business because alliances can shift. And when you first start saying to somebody, you know, I think it's time that we do something about this man who's been behaving so badly, then you have the worry that the person you're talking to might go to the aggressor and say, you've got an enemy over there, what do you want us to do about him? So you don't know quite how people are going to feel. You have to be very, very careful about developing these ideas of, shall we all get together and dispatch this person? It needs pretty sophisticated language. In other words, I'm not ruling out the possibility that species like Neanderthals that did not self-domesticate, they might have had language, but what happened with sapiens some 300,000 or 400,000 years ago is that our language got sufficiently sophisticated that we could undertake this delicate dance of being able to form a coalition that was secret and that would lead to a plan that might be enacted hours, days, even weeks later to kill someone safely.
Mm-hmm. And when we're talking about human cooperation or the evolution of human cooperation and human morality, I guess that one of the big topics that is brought to the table by biologists particularly has to do with group selection. So what is your position when it comes to that specific topic? Do you think that there's any solid evidence that we have a sort of multi-level selection process occurring in us and also other species that include also group selection or not?
I am unconvinced by the genetic group selection arguments. Mm-hmm. I think that they are understandable in the sense that humans clearly show a lot of group-related behavior that is mysterious. It's difficult to understand why it is that individuals are often somewhat self-sacrificial and share food with others in the group or do other things that benefit individuals in the group at some expense to themselves. And I think it's true that genetic group selection is a sort of potentially reasonable mechanism that could account for some of that. But the mechanisms that have so far been suggested for genetic group selection in humans pretty much apply to chimpanzees. I mean, for instance, they have been thought to depend on high rates of killing between groups, where intergroup aggression is really, really important, and this could lead to selection in favor of individuals who help the group at the expense to themselves, because it's so important for the group to win battles against neighboring groups. That's true of chimpanzees, but the consequences of this supposed mechanism have not played out in chimpanzees in the direction of reduced aggression or investment in the group or moral behavior. So for that sort of reason and some others, I am very mistrustful of the genetic group selection arguments. And on the other hand, I think that Christopher Boehm is absolutely right in his book Moral Origins from 2012, in which he argues that the development of the system of capital punishment, of being able to kill aggressive members of your own group, this leads to a dynamic in which the problem of moral evolution is solved. And the problem is, why is it that individuals are less selfish, less self-centered in their behavior than we would expect on the basis of a simple natural selection theory? And the answer is, people are less self-centered than you might expect, because if they are too selfish in their behavior, they too can be subject to being killed by the beta males forming their coalition. And that applies to the beta males themselves, and it applies to women, it applies to children, it applies to anybody in the group. All of a sudden, you've got this power that is instantiated in the collection of beta males, who are, you know, the husbands basically, and they can exert that power. And if somebody behaves in a way that is inimical to the interests of those males, then they can be killed. And that leads to a very strong selection pressure for conformity and for investment in the group.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so when people in evolution talk about comparing different groups and perhaps their success in terms of, let's say that we have one group where people cooperate more among themselves and another group that is less cooperative, and the first group is more successful, perhaps they are able to kill the members of the other group and conquer their territory or something like that. Could we consider some sort of group selection occurring at least the cultural level there, or not?
Yes, I think the cultural group selection concept, which I think is very poorly named because it confuses us into thinking that it's like genetic group selection. Right. So, you know, I prefer to call it something more like group-culture selection, you know, selection for a group culture. And yes, if one group develops a particular system of cultural behavior that is very effective, I mean, it might be just that they have a better weapon, but if it applies to the group as a whole, people often think about some kind of institution that is involved in encouraging people to invest in the group, you know, maybe through some religious belief or some system that punishes people who don't behave in conformity with group benefits. These sorts of things can, yes, of course, give a group advantage in inter-group competition, and then the net result may be that culture will spread, so there will be selection in favor of that group culture. But what that should not be confused with is any evidence for genetic change. Yeah. So the questions that motivate me in the goodness paradox are those that think about us as a species, why we as a species have this astonishing unaggressiveness, and whether or not cultural group selection, or group culture selection as I prefer to call it, has any effects on our genes is something that has not yet been demonstrated or strongly, well, maybe it's been argued in cases, but it certainly hasn't been shown. And it seems quite unlikely, because when we think about the genetic consequences that apply to our species as a whole, then we're going to be thinking about a time when we were mobile hunter-gatherers. And the notion that there would have been really effective group cultures that made groups effective in war is undermined by the notion or the observation that the kinds of war that occurred in mobile group hunter-gatherers did not involve much self-sacrifice at all. It was small groups going out and raiding into neighboring camps and then immediately running as if they were confronted. You don't see battles where, I mean, there's very little evidence anyway of battles in which individuals are taking risks for each other and supporting each other. So that kind of behavior, which is now associated with large societies, does not seem to have been part of our evolutionary past.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so during our conversation, we've been trying to trace back the evolutionary origins of our self-domestication and our low reactive aggression. But when we get past the advent of agriculture and the development of agricultural societies, is it possible that we get sort of a gene culture coevolutionary processes where, through some sorts of social institutions like systems of law and police and other things that allow for societies to control individual behavior, that in some way or another we further promoted the selection or favored the selection of less aggressive individuals, or not?
That is a question that has not, to my knowledge, been really deeply addressed anywhere. It is, I think, a really interesting question. The fact that you have gene culture coevolution involving digestive adaptations does raise the possibility that you could have gene culture coevolution involving psychological adaptations. It would mean that if it's true, that there would be differences among human populations, geographic populations, that would be associated with tendencies for aggressiveness, tendencies for ability to control aggressiveness, of a type that will be a challenging thing for our species to learn about. Because if we start finding that these sorts of differences exist among populations, then that is the kind of material that racists will just jump on. So it's an area that is intellectually plausible, that hasn't been researched in detail. There are these little hints of frequencies of genes associated with aggression that occur at higher population and then frequencies in some populations than others. But very, very early days. In my answer, what I'm really doing is emphasizing how cautious we should be in thinking about that area, because you don't want to talk about it until you really know what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yes, right. It's very problematic. But I also asked you that question because you might know something about it, and I was trying perhaps to connect it with the work that has been done by people like Steven Pinker in The Better Angels of Our Nature, and even more recently in Enlightenment Now, where he really tries to trace back what might have been the social processes that might have contributed to reducing the rates of violence in human societies around the globe. So,
yeah, and these are major issues. Pinker in those books did not. He was aware of the distinction between reactive and proactive aggression, and he discusses it a little bit in Better Angels, but he didn't follow that line of argument to think about the way in which the contemporary reductions in violence have been due to less reactive or less proactive aggression. And I think that it'll be a very interesting thing to try and do that. And again, he did not try and associate the changes that have happened over the last decades and hundreds and maybe thousands of years with genetic change. The great majority of what we see is clearly the result of institutional changes. Mm-hmm. And I think it's going to be a really interesting area to see how this develops. I don't want to say any more than that about it at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good. Okay, so I think we've already gone through the major topics of your book, The Goodness Paradox, Dr. Wrangham. So just before we go, would you like perhaps to tell people, apart from what I've referred to in the introduction of the interview, what might be some other good online sources if people want to get in touch with more of your work?
Well, my main media presence, I guess, is the website of the Kibale Chimpanzee Project. So if you Google the Kibale Chimpanzee Project, then you will see the work that we're doing with chimpanzees there, and some of the associated sort of talks and writings that I have deriving from my chimpanzee work.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I will be leaving links to that and also to the rest of your work in the description box of the video, Dr. Wrangham. And so, again, thank you a lot for taking the time to be here with us today. It was really a pleasure to everyone. So,
thank you for your great questions. It was really fun to talk.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would really like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Otherwise, if you don't like Patreon, you can also go to PayPal or Subscribestar. All of the links are in the description box of the video and also on my channel. And apart from that, you can also, of course, leave a like, share the interview and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons, Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condriano, and my first producer, Isar Webe. Thank you for all.